Hey Shubs, so today we're going to talk about bug bounties. So, a topic that everybody likes to hear about from us, right? So, particularly you. So, um, in particular, we're going to focus on bug bounties, but in the context of, a company that's running a program and how they can think of ways that they can optimize their bug bounty program. And, for Asset Note, it was born out of the bug bounty space. So a lot of the principles there and a lot of the philosophy of Asset Note and our product, comes from the principles and the ideals inside the bounty space. So things like wide breadth of coverage when it comes to looking at an attack surface, heavy focus on deep mapping and understanding of an attack surface, continuous, right? I mean, we do things hourly because the faster the better. You don't get paid for being second. And really high signal and high impact findings. That's another sort of key characteristic, and all of those have flowed through to our product. And so we do often get asked about how do we think about bug bounties, how do we think about bug bounties in the context of ASM. And so that's what we're going to cover today in this episode. So maybe a good place to start, and I think this would be good for you, is thinking about let's cut through the noise a little bit on bug bounties and think about it from a hunter's perspective. That might be the good place to start, where we think about what are some of the realities of how you evaluate what to hack on and how you approach it, in terms of choosing what programs and where to spend your time on bounties, and what's some of the reality there, and what's your perspective as a hunter looking at that.
Yeah, I mean, it's changed over the years, but these days, given that there are so many great programs out there, they're all really competing for the same slice of talent, really. And even over the last 10 years or so, what I've found is that there's still the same 20 or 30 people that are exceeding expectations in all these bug bounty programs. And yeah, I mean, it is really interesting in terms of what programs I pick. And, a lot of people out there might think, oh, the only way to be successful at bug bounties is to do private programs. But I'll be honest with you, I've only been participating in public programs for the majority of the last 10 years. And it's not as if you need to get those private invites to be successful, for example. And I also know that most of the talented people in the bug bounty space that I'm aware of, they also are mostly focusing on public programs. Because it is those programs that are the most mature and are offering the most amount of money from a bug bounty perspective. No, don't get me wrong.
Interesting perspective too, right? Because I go to live hacking events with you and things like that, and it's all the same people, right? It's the same
Yeah.
30, 40, 50 people. And if you think about it in the context of the crowd, right? It's a very, very small percentage of the crowd that's at that kind of tier. The vast
Yeah,
majority are not at that tier, right?
yeah, exactly. And you might see some additions here and there, like some new talent coming in, but for the most part, it is that same 30 or 40 people. And over time, with the diversification of bug bounty platforms as well, we're actually seeing this crowd even whittle away, even in existing bounty platforms as they've moved to another one, or they're focusing on a specific program that's on another platform. So yeah, it is getting a bit more fragmented, I would say. Definitely each platform is fighting for the same talent, which I find really interesting, because that means that whichever platform has the highest paying program is the one that's ultimately going to win at the end of the day, in terms of this talent acquisition, at the very least.
So would it be fair to say that the hunters follow the program more so than the platform?
The hunters follow the payouts more so than anything else, and yes, that's definitely related to the program. Yeah.
So it's also creating this sort of splintering effect in the market from the hunter side, where now, thinking about it from a company perspective a little bit, and we'll dive into it a little bit more later. But you've got this you've got this sort of splintering of the crowd amongst the different platforms, because they're following specific programs. So now you can't really can you really sort of say that if you're going to pick a particular platform because of the crowd, it's not really the right way to think about it from a company perspective? Like, you should be thinking about it more from, I guess, how your payout and your program and the parameters that you set there.
Yeah,
You
for
know,
sure.
I'm thinking about it from the perspective of attracting talent. Obviously, there might be differences between the platforms and their services that might sway you one way or the other, right? But from a talent attraction perspective, there's not really, a singular platform that holds an advantage there, right?
Yeah, and to be clear, like I think that the primary thing these programs are fighting for is our time. It's not like they need people to be looking at their attack surfaces, their software, whatever else. And let's say there is a program, like I could have multiple programs. There may be a program on HackerOne that's great. There may be a program on BugCrowd that's great. But if I find that the one on BugCrowd is paying significantly more or vice versa, that's where most of my time is going to go. Because that's naturally where I want to maximize the amount of, I guess, outcome I get for the effort that I'm putting in. And this is what I'm seeing, honestly, is like, at least between all of the top bug bounty hunters that I've worked with over the last couple of years, everyone is focusing on the programs that have the highest payouts. And that means that an entire platform can be forgotten about, like HackerOne or BugCrowd, whatever it is, or the other platforms. They can just be forgotten about until they're done with that program. And that might not be for a long time. It might have to take that program reducing its payouts or them treating you unfairly or something happens. Only then you make that decision to then move off that platform and go to another program somewhere else. And yeah, that's really what I'm seeing.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it would be fair to say as well, if you think about all of those points, that the top tier, like when we're talking about that top 30, 40, 50, which is basically the top 1%, right? Or even potentially even the top 1% of the 1% in a way. They're not necessarily hacking on hundreds of programs at a time, right? There's maybe two or three, that they're focused on at any given point in time, right?
Yeah, unless you're doing a lot of automation, and even then, at best, you're just getting through dupes in some scenarios where you beat the race. Most of the time, most people manual hacking, they're focusing on individual programs. And to be fair, I think you'll probably get into this later in this call. You don't actually want to be paying for a lot of these automated issues in the first place. You want to be paying for that undivided attention from a hacker, from a manual hacking perspective, which actually leads to real security impact beyond just, you've got a misconfigured DNS record here or an open S3 bucket there.
Yeah. So in terms of tracking the talent, right? So we've spoken about, large scope and large payout, basically. So, with the payouts for the individual bugs being high, there's more potential reward for your time, and with a large enough scope, there's more potential to find more of those issues, right? So, but what about beyond the payouts? Are there other sort of elements of a program, like the terms of the program, or the anything else like that kind of influences the decision, whether you're going to invest time in or not?
There's one really big factor that influences that decision, and that's the speed of the payouts. Often what I find, especially for myself and other hackers included, if a program is going end-to-end resolving a bug or paying it out at least within a week's time, and I would say week being probably around the sweet spot for attracting this sort of crowd, people are much more likely to participate in that bug bounty program, especially be loyal to that program if they treat them in a way that's, okay, we've verified your issue, we've validated it, triaged it, and paid you out within a week, then you're going to attract a lot of hunters.
Yeah. What about other things, right? So like, one of the things that we've spoken about a little bit on previous calls, and people, who follow the work that we do at Asset Note will know that we spend a lot of time, in researching, security vulnerabilities inside large, widely deployed enterprise software, right? We spoke about in the last episode on, shadow exposure and why we focus on that kind of research. But this is also something that I think I see in that sort of really top tier of the bug hunting community, where they go deep on that and look for those more fundamental issues. And how does that play into other things that we've also discussed and touched on a little bit in the past? Things like, disclosure policies and NDAs, and, even something like, HackerOne's new 0-day window. How does that impact, from a top bug hunter perspective, like what you're willing to do through these programs?
Yeah, for the most part, any vendor software that's running a bug bounty program, if you ever report a vulnerability to them, you're not going to be able to speak about it publicly without explicit permission from them. And this is something that I think a lot of hackers have caught themselves in that sort of situation where they've reported something and they've wanted to talk about it, but they're unable to because they've agreed to the default terms and conditions of the platform. So that's definitely one to keep an eye out for. But I think the more interesting one, and definitely one that's really causing disparity between the platforms, is this new HackerOne policy around vulnerabilities in third-party software. And essentially, for those that don't know, HackerOne has published some detailed platform standards that they enforce across their platform, and one of them is around third-party vulnerabilities. And basically, what they state is that you're not supposed to take a third-party vulnerability and use it on other bug bounty programs before it's been communicated with the third-party owner and it's been patched by the third-party owner. And this is a really interesting area because, HackerOne's the only platform that has this standard. And I think that, to be honest, my opinion on this is that there are a lot of customers that are sitting ducks now, which have many services on the internet that are affected by zero-day vulnerabilities. And bug bounty hunters no longer feel comfortable reporting that on HackerOne's platform. At least I don't, certainly, from my perspective. But this is definitely a new standard, and I know that HackerOne is trying hard to find a sweet spot here. But at the same time, this is really discouraging for a lot of researchers.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and when we think about it in the context of what we do, because on one hand, I think the standard of, hey, you should be reporting this to the vendor first is the right position to take. But then, this kind of arbitrary limitation on the exploitation of that, through these bug bounty programs and the reporting of that through these bug bounty programs is, as you say, leaving a lot of people open and exposed, So, anytime that we do sort of research, right, we report it to the vendor first, that's the right thing to do, right? And, we want the vendor to get started on a fix, basically. But we also then put it in the platform for our customers so they understand, where they're exposed, and we provide, the mitigations. We've spoken about the work that we do on the mitigation side for the zero-day research to these guys, so they're well and truly ahead of the curve in terms of being protected. And, the reality is that these sorts of vulnerabilities don't just come into existence or spring into existence when a researcher finds them, right? They exist in the software for however long they've existed in the software at that point. And so, especially once word starts to get out, there's advisories released, even, things like that, people start to research this stuff. It may already be actively exploited or known about, and there's also people, reverse engineering, issues, things leaking out, all kinds of potential scenarios there. And then arbitrarily limiting the visibility that, companies and customers ultimately get into that is not, I think, not really like a good position to take. And it's just exposing that. It's just creating a level of exposure that's unnecessary. But I also am sympathetic to the position that these sort of platforms are in, right? Having customers on both sides of that equation and how they manage it. So, I do get that, but from our perspective, from a security perspective, I think arbitrarily limiting what you can do with that is not ideal. It doesn't produce ideal outcomes for the end customers at the end of the day. And so
sometimes,
go ahead.
Sometimes these vendors aren't even really playing ball here with fixing these issues, and for however long that these issues aren't fixed, you've got this exposure across the internet for whatever customer that's affected by this. And I refuse to believe that only one single person can find that security issue. Like, that issue exists. It's existed for a long time. It's not as if someone else can't find it. I don't understand why there's this level of secrecy.
Your assets on that point, right? I wouldn't,
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it over the last couple of years with ransomware groups exploiting zero days and managed file transfer software. Those 0 days existed for a long time. I'm sure they were part of the arsenal of many different groups before the zero days were exploited by the ransomware group. So it's just one of those things where I feel like, if we're genuine about this idea of securing the attack surfaces of, customers, then this needs to be accounted for. This needs to be something that can be, at least safely shared to these customers in a way that they can remediate these issues before someone like a ransomware group comes along, exploits them, and encrypts them.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know we can talk about this sort of stuff at length, and I know we've discussed in some other episodes. But maybe coming back to this idea of, okay, so you're a company that runs a bug bounty program. How do you get the most out of it, and what are some of the ways you can get the most out of it? And maybe starting at what does all the stuff that we've discussed so far mean as a company running a program? I think the first thing that we've touched on is that it is a two-sided marketplace, right? Where you've got the bug hunters on one side, and the companies on the other, and they're both in competition with with each other on the side of the market, right? So obviously it's a lot has been written and said about the hunters competing with each other and like having to be first, and thinking about speed and whatever in their processes. But perhaps what's less talked about, which we've sort of discussed so far, which is that the customers, right, the ones running the program, they're also competing with every other program, one on that platform, but just in general across multiple different platforms. And so, and if we say that hunters, or at least the top hunters, are attracted to large scope and large payouts, if you don't have large scope and large payouts, how are you going to compete with those that do? And what level of talent and what level of scrutiny are you actually getting at the end of the day, on your attack surface? And so that's one thing to consider. And I think the reality is, if you don't have a high payout table, particularly for the upper end of town, you're at a real disadvantage. And at the end of the day, that's not necessarily something that's easy to solve, because companies are different sizes, different levels of budget, different levels of commitment from, say, executives into the security budget at the companies. And so that's going to vary wildly, and you might be constrained with your capability to be able to match that. And so what you really should be thinking about is really optimization. And we'll get to optimization in a little bit, and what we mean, and some of the things that we would recommend, and how things like ASM can help with that. But the other thing I would say as well, from a company perspective, is most of what you're going to see when you open up a bug bounty program is scan traffic from open source scanners. Like, that's just the reality. Like, that's probably, in my estimation, and these are just rough numbers, I would say that's 90% of the activity that you're going to see on any given bug bounty program, right? It's not the activity that you see from like these top tier bug hunters that present their research at conferences that everybody just is in awe of, in terms of how they got there and what they did. That's the exception. That's not the rule, I think. And so, you kind of, as a company, you have to be prepared for that onslaught, like the good and the bad. And so, what that means, I think, is that you need to have a certain level of maturity before you can really optimize and get the most out of a bug bounty program. And I know Katie Mazouris talks a lot about this. She's OG bug bounty, well before any of the platforms came into existence, and she talks about this point all the time. Bug bounty is good. There's a lot of value in it. It is an important part of a mature security program, but it is not the only part, and it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve all the issues, and you do need to be at a certain level of maturity. If you struggle with process for identifying, attributing issues to owners and fixing them and remediating them, opening yourself up to a bug bounty, it's just going to multiply that problem by 10, by 100, whatever, right? And so you need to have that, and she's 100% spot on with that point. So yeah, I mean, do you have any other thoughts on, thinking about it more from the company side of what this sort of stuff means, for companies in reality?
Yeah, I think that there's a few elements. Firstly, I've seen a lot of companies that have come into bug bounties as well, where they're not able to stay on top of the amount of things coming in. And as you mentioned earlier, with a lot of people using open source scanners, they're often submitting a lot of things that may look kind of real, but it actually requires some sort of investigation, and turns out that it doesn't have any security impact, and so on and so forth. So what I've been seeing, especially from the spray and pray crowd, if I'd like to say, is they're basically chucking all these new new checks directly at every new bug bounty program. They're inundating them with so many submissions where, obviously HackerOne's triage and BugCrowd's triage deal with this on a day-to-day basis and the other platforms as well. But there's just so much of that noise, I guess. And certainly as someone who's trying to invest in the security of a company, you cannot have that much noise if you don't have your basics covered, which is what I think you're trying to get at
Yeah.
generally, because you're trying to actually get some level of maturity before you can comfortably do a bug bounty program and have that comfort.
Yeah. If you can't easily, filter out that noise, then it's just going to become a problem. And it's kind of interesting when you talk about like when we talk about this idea of the scan traffic, right? And yeah, everybody the pray and spray spray and pray crowd, right? I like that. I like that term. But what's interesting about that is that it's really homogenous. And what I find even more interesting is that it's not just the security researchers and the bug hunters that are utilizing the exact same scanning and the exact same signatures for good or bad, right? Like, whether there's good outcomes or, the signatures have false positives, or they're terrible, or they're noisy, or they're not identifying things and they're missing things, whatever the good and bad of the output of that, it's all the same. And what I find really interesting is the rise of the use of these open source scanners by in products, right, in security tools. Like, it's one thing for a company to say, okay, well, we'll use that internally so we can kind of get on top of this and preempt that output, right? That's very smart, and that's a good idea, right? But security products that charge money for it, they're not differentiated anymore, right? They've got the same scan engine, the same scan output that any company can go and get for free, which I just find hilarious, right? And it leads to a lot of homogenization across these security scanning tools. But maybe that's a separate point and something to dive into. But when we think about what companies can do, I think the key way to think about it is like, how do you optimize this? How do you maximize the outcomes that you want? Which is, you want the highest security outcomes for the least expense and layout. And so really what you want to be doing is avoiding sucky payouts. And what do I mean by sucky payouts? These are things that you could have found with some sort of open source scanner. This is stuff that you should have been aware of, that is real, and that is an actual issue. But because the payouts of a bug bounty program are tied to impact, it's still impactful. You're paying out a lot of money for something that you just don't really feel good about paying out. I've had this, I've had customer conversations, where they've come to us, and, one of the things they say is like, I just want to stop losing to these kinds of, shitty issues, basically. I think, that's really at the heart of, how we optimize, a bug bounty program. So really, if we start to sort of dive into that kind of concept a little bit more, is, you want to avoid, paying out for stuff that really you should be able to find yourself more effectively, in a way that's more economically effective, where, maybe it's, something where it's an open source scanner, at least you're getting the bar of what everybody else is just throwing at your assets. Or if you want to raise that a little bit, something that's a cut above, but something that is on a fixed fee basis rather than variable. I mean, we've seen this happen where you find enough criticals on an attack surface, you can kill a bug bounty budget in one night. I've seen it at events, dude, where they're huge companies that already know that they're going to pay out a lot of money for this event, in the 6 and 7 figures, and they still run out of budget and have to deal with that halfway through the event. We've both experienced that, right? And so, I think getting to a state where you can kind of preempt that, and avoid paying out for those sorts of issues is a huge win, right? Because then that sets you up for being more competitive as a program in general, but also reduces the noise that comes out of your bug bounty program, or at least makes the noise easier to manage, right?
Yeah. And just going back on that point about open source tooling and stuff, what I find really funny is almost every all the best hackers I know don't use any automated tooling when they're looking for security issues.
Mm.
Like they're not
Yep.
spending time on that, and those are the hackers that you really want to be, attracting to your program at the end of the day. And those are the Franz Rosens of the world, the Matthiases of the world, where they're actually going to deeply look at the application and understand exactly what's going on in order to find these really deep, difficult to find issues.
Yeah.
Anyone can run scanners. It doesn't really lead to the outcomes you're looking for from a security perspective, because anyone serious about breaking into your organization is going to go a few steps further than just running a scanner.
Yeah. Yeah. You're not raising the bar that much if that's the level that you're going to. And yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like even the automation that I see that sort of top tier use, it's very bespoke. It's not this sort of mass market off the shelf kind of stuff, right? It's very targeted to specific techniques that they may have developed, or something that's kind of unique, or even on the recon side, kind of following on from what we spoke about in the previous episodes, a few episodes back, thinking about what they're actually trying to achieve, and then automating that at scale rather than generic kind of techniques. And so that's kind of interesting. And like when we think about the scanners, the other side of it as well is when you open up a bug bounty program, you're opening yourself up to continuous evaluation, right? So you do need to have processes and tooling in place that is also continuous, and ideally, you know, highly continuous, like faster than what you're going to be getting out of a bounty program. If you can kind of beat the hackers at their game, particularly and more specifically the spray and pray crowd, right? If you can kind of beat them at their game and be faster than them and more optimized than them, and ideally with automation that's a level above them, then you're just basically shutting that off, right? In terms of paying for the economically for that output, because if you beat them to these sorts of findings, it's a dupe, right? They don't get paid for dupes. You don't have to pay out dupes. If you if you beat them at the game in terms of the discovery, right? So you've got a full, complete picture of your attack surface that is, a bare minimum as good as what somebody else is going to have from a hunting side, or better, right? Then you're in a position where you can preempt those sorts of issues where you've got this asset that nobody knows about, that still has real issues on it, impactful issues, that's just easy to exploit and easy to identify, just because they've found that asset and you haven't. And if you can start to do this, and of course, given modern environments, they're highly dynamic, so this is not a one-off thing. You can't kind of like uplift your maturity and look at your scope on a once-off basis and that's it, because your attack surface is constantly changing. And so you need to be looking at this continuously, and you need to be trying to beat them and be more proactive and more preemptive of the stuff that's coming there. And then what you'll start to see is that you don't have to pay out for these low level, terrible findings that you don't feel comfortable about. And once you start to get to that point, that's where you can start to offer higher payouts, because you've got confidence that you can manage this, and you're managing this internally, that you can open it up, and then you start to attract the top tier that's going to look for these deeper issues that are going to provide the level of scrutiny that even if it's 5 or 10K for a critical, that they find that you really don't feel bad about paying for it, right? Because it's really worth it. What you want to avoid is feeling bad when you're paying these sorts of things. And some of the
Speaking,
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, speaking about beating bug bounty hunters to findings, we've done that several times at Asset Node, and what's funny is sometimes some of these people will reach out to me being like, "How did you do that? How did you beat me to this?" It's just because we're going at that speed
Yeah.
and we're at that scale, and we have that much knowledge of an attack surface that we're able to beat bug bounty hunters consistently. So this is something that I've spoken to several bug bounty hunters about. Like, yes, like we beat you,
Yeah.
but there's
And
basically.
we have a team of highly talented engineers and security researchers that are pushing this stuff to the limit, right? To be as fast as possible. for this exact reason at the end of the day. But it is always funny when we get those messages from bug hunters, like
Yeah.
kind of annoyed that
Yeah.
that they
Very
didn't get their nice
frustrated.
bug because
Yeah.
we beat them to it, with the platform and a customer. And so, the other side of it, actually, we touched on it a little bit, is scope, like optimizing your scope. Now, a lot of the bug bounty platforms will advise you, that you should be, progressively opening up your scope, right? As rather than going full scope, whole hog, whole attack surface, star dot, whatever. You want to be kind of progressive with that, which is good advice, right? But if you don't have a good handle on what that is, and again, a continuous, understanding of what that is, then, you're still not being as optimized as possible. Because, if you don't have a good understanding of what makes up your attack surface at any given time, and then tracking that as it evolves over time, and the level of maturity and exposure that exists in those points, how are you going to be able to make informed decisions around what you progressively open up? You might go too hard too soon. You might have stuff in your scope that you think is a good scope to open up, but is kind of like actually terrible because you've missed half of the stuff that does fall under that scope. And so, having a good and up to date understanding of your attack surface is really critical, I think, in terms of being more optimized in the outcomes that you're going to get out of your bug bounty program. And so, yeah, no, the final point, probably, I think, in terms of optimization, and this is just sort of coming back to the same theme, right? Is really avoiding that low hanging fruit, and we've spoken about it in a couple of different ways in terms of being continuous, having scan capabilities that are cut above, what the bug hunters are throwing at you, and also having processes that are in place that support that, and are mature and effective in terms of supporting that, visibility and continuous assessment. But ultimately, it all comes down to the same point, that when you start to filter that out through these sort of more proactive measures and these more consistent measures, you're then raising the bar in terms of what you need to pay out. You're then taking away the stuff that is not value for money at the end of the day, right? If you're getting something that's critical on an asset, that's in scope, that could easily have been found through some level of automation or some level of process internally, or whatever the case may be, for a much lower price, then you're just wasting money at that point. And what that means is, if you're spending too much on those sorts of outcomes and those sorts of issues, it does limit what you can do budgetarily in terms of offering larger payouts and incentivizing and attracting the higher tier hackers to your program. And I think that really comes down to that point of, like, you need to just raise the bar, and then once you can do that, you start attracting the higher tier hackers, and with the higher payouts, and you're still getting optimized results, because the outcome from those guys, the guys at your level, and the level of the guys that you mentioned, like France and whatever, that's what you want, right? But you need to pay for it, and if you don't have the money because you're wasting it and you're not optimized, then you're not going to be able to offer that realistically. And so that's probably the overarching kind of like message, or way that you can optimize this. And I think ASM is a good way, that, like, a good ASM, at least a true ASM, will cover off all those areas for you. So that will be a way that you can utilize that. And we have many customers that run bug bounty programs, and we've touched on some of the feedback that we've received on that. But that is one of the interesting and core use cases that those customers in particular have with Acinode, is that they are utilizing it to optimize their bug bounty program. And you probably and it also helps as well. We've got integrations with the major bug bounty platforms as well, and it kind of just helps to seamlessly sort of work within these processes. but ultimately it's these more fundamental, principles and ideas that they're going for, that's being enabled through that level of thinking. Cool. So, any other points to wrap up on the bug bounty side?
Um,
Anything you want to add?
yeah, I guess there are some bug bounty programs out there that are really hard to compete with, and I am seeing this convergence of some of the best hackers focusing on the same bug bounty program just because it's so hard to compete with. So, you know, I think that in this market, you have to really be competitive, either in speed or in payouts, in order to attract the same bug bounty crowd that you're looking for from a security analysis perspective. That's just my opinion, coming as a bug bounty hunter and also as someone that helps build an ASM. We can definitely help with a lot of the fundamental issues that are solved through automation, and we have many techniques that no other ASM or tooling has, which really, frankly, some of them are more akin to some of the more advanced techniques that some of these hackers are using in the first place.
Yeah, I mean that's what we hear a lot from these, particularly these customers, that this is a core use case for them, is that what comes out of our platform is a lot more like what they're getting out of their bug bounty program, instead of what they would get out of any kind of traditional scanner. Which is, just again comes from what we discussed earlier. Like, we're from this space and we get it, right? And we're pushing to be at that standard and that level. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting. It's an interesting topic at the end of the day. And conceptually, it's kind of easy. It's like, yeah, okay, well, you want better output from your program, pay more, right? But like, if only pay more was easy. There's a lot that's packed into pay more. And I think hopefully what we've been able to cover is how you can think about some of the tooling and the processes internally, and ways that you can start to approach how to optimize your existing spend, so you can push your existing budget further. I'm sure there's a bunch of CISOs and managers and whatever that would just love to, like, yeah, I'd love to just be able to pay more, right? It's just not that easy in reality. And so hopefully this gives some kind of thought to that, and gets that sort of thinking. If you're in that position, think of some of these approaches that you can take. And so, yeah, I think we can call that there, and wrap that up. Another good episode. Thanks to everybody who's been listening and watching this, and providing feedback. We really appreciate it. And yeah, if you're interested, always check out Asinote, asinote.io. Too easy. Thanks, Shubs.